I had 300 yards of rain-slicked asphalt and 4 armed security guards to bypass before the sniper in the shadows pulled the trigger. My lungs burned like I'd swallowed broken glass, and the blood from the gash on my forehead was starting to blur my vision, but I couldn't stop pedaling. Not when I had the devil's death warrant tucked into my messenger bag. My fingers, numb from the biting Atlantic chill, gripped the manila envelope so tight the edges crinkled. It was a flimsy piece of paper, a cheap, thin shield against the high-caliber lead currently being aimed at this building. Outside, the waterfront was a black, churning maw, the wind howling through the pier like a warning. But as I crashed through the heavy oak doors of the Gala, the world shifted. Here, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and aged scotch. The gilded pier hummed with the low frequency of old money, the clink of crystal, the soft shuffle of leather soles on polished marble, and the hushed, arrogant laughter of people who believed they were untouchable. I was a stain on their perfection, a shivering, mud-splattered ghost in a room full of silk and diamonds. I approached the center table like I was walking toward a firing squad. Sebastian Cade sat with his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline glittering behind him like a throne of neon lights. He looked like he'd been forged in a furnace, intense, still, and terrifyingly calm. His jaw was a hard line of granite, his dark hair dampened by the humidity, and his hand rested on the table with the casual grace of a predator at rest. Beside him, Elena leaned in, her pale silk dress catching the light as she whispered something that made her eyes brighten. She looked safe. She looked loved. She was the only person in this room who didn't realize she was sitting in a graveyard. 10 minutes ago, I had been just a girl on a bike looking for a signature to finish my shift. I'd taken the service alley shortcut near the North Pier when I saw the black SUV idling in the dark. I'd watched a man step out, his movements too precise, too practiced. He'd dropped an envelope while checking a long, heavy case in his trunk, a case shaped exactly like a breakdown sniper rifle. I'd picked it up thinking it was a lost manifest. Instead, I found a surveillance photo of Sebastian Cade with a red crosshair centered over his heart. The photo wasn't just a threat, it was a mathematical certainty. No names, no demands, just the cold, calculated geometry of a professional hit. The timestamp on the back said the delivery was scheduled for tonight. As I reached the table, the background shifted. A man by the bar, suit too tight, hand too close to his jacket, narrowed his eyes. I didn't have time to be polite. I didn't have time to be a professional. I slammed the crinkled envelope onto the white linen tablecloth, right between Cade's scotch and his sister's hand. "Mr. Cade," I rasped, my voice cracking under the weight of the terror. "You aren't expecting a package, but you need to open this. Now." The air in the room suddenly felt arctic. This wasn't a delivery anymore. It was a countdown. The rain didn't just fall in the docklands, it punished. It turned the industrial labyrinth of the North Pier into a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and slick, oily puddles that reflected the sickly neon of distant skyscrapers. I was already behind schedule, my calves screaming as I stood up on the pedals of my battered mountain bike, trying to make the 10-minute window for the waterfront gala delivery. My sister's rent depended on this night's tips, and a late status on the app was a luxury I couldn't afford. I took the shortcut through the service alley behind the old cannery, a narrow throat of brick and shadow where the wind died down just enough for me to hear it, the low, rhythmic hum of a luxury engine. I skidded to a halt, the scent of expensive gasoline and wet pavement filling my nose. A black SUV sat idling 50 yards ahead, its headlights extinguished. It was a ghost in the dark. A man stepped out, his movements so fluid and precise they felt mechanical. He didn't look like a driver. He wore a tactical jacket that suggested a hidden lethality, and as he popped the trunk, the interior light spilled over a long, velvet-lined case. My breath hitched. I knew that shape from the movies, but seeing the matte black barrel of a breakdown sniper rifle in the flesh made the air in the alley feel several degrees colder. He reached into his pocket to check a device, and in his haste, a small manila envelope slipped from his grip, fluttering to the wet asphalt like a dying bird. He didn't notice. He closed the trunk with a soft, expensive thud and climbed back into the vehicle, disappearing into the rain toward the lighthouse point. I should have kept riding. I should have minded the business that paid me. But curiosity is a curse for people with nothing to lose. I leaned my bike against a dumpster and snatched the envelope from the puddle. Inside wasn't a manifest or a shipping order. It was a single, high-resolution surveillance photograph. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. It was Sebastian Cade. He was captured through a long-range lens, sitting at the very table I was supposed to be delivering to in 5 minutes. But it was the red digital crosshair centered over his solar plexus that made the world tilt. On the back, written in a hand so neat it looked printed, was a single timestamp, 21:15. I checked my watch. 21:05. This wasn't a package. It was a countdown. I wasn't just a courier anymore. I was holding the only evidence of a murder that hadn't happened yet. My survival instinct told me to drop the paper and ride the other way, but I thought of the man's sister in the photo, Elena, smiling beside him, oblivious to the glass-shattering death traveling toward them. I swung my leg over the bike, ignored the blood dripping into my eye from a fresh scrape, and began to pedal. I wasn't riding for a tip anymore. I was riding to stop a ghost. The heavy oak doors of the Gala didn't just open. They buckled under the weight of my desperation. I was a jagged tear in a fabric of velvet and gold, my soaked hoodie dripping gray rainwater onto a carpet that probably cost more than my life. I didn't wait for the security team to process the girl with the bleeding forehead and the mud-caked boots. I ran. Hey, you can't be in here. A suit with a wire in his ear lunged for my arm, his fingers snapping shut on empty air as I dove past a dessert trolley. My heart was a frantic drum, a wild, rhythmic warning that the clock had hit 0. I could feel the invisible line of sight from the lighthouse across the bay, a cold, predatory gaze narrowing toward the man at the center of the room. Sebastian Cade didn't flinch as I skidded to a halt at his table, nearly overturning a silver bucket of champagne. His security detail closed in like a ring of iron, hands disappearing into their jackets, but Cade raised a single, scarred hand. The room went silent, the ambient hum of wealth dying in an instant. Up close, his eyes weren't just dark, they were absolute, 2 voids that seemed to calculate my threat level in a heartbeat. You have 5 seconds before they break your neck, Cade said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that felt like a blade against my throat. Make them count. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I slammed the crinkled, water-stained envelope onto the white linen, right between his crystal glass and his sister's trembling hand. The photo slid out, the red crosshairs stark and violent against the elegant setting. Elena let out a sharp, fractured breath, her face draining of color as she recognized the angle of the shot. Cade's gaze shifted to the photo. For a fraction of a second, the marble mask broke. His pupils blown wide, he didn't look at me. He looked through the photo, tracing the geometry of his own death. He realized it before anyone else, the timestamp, the position, the impossibility of the warning. Down, he roared, his voice shattering the stillness like a gunshot. He didn't wait for them to move. He lunged across the table, his massive frame a living shield over Elena just as the floor-to-ceiling window behind him turned into 1,000 diamond-sharp shards. The sound wasn't a bang, it was a rhythmic crack hiss of suppressed fire. High velocity, Lee tore through the velvet back of his chair, precisely where his heart had been a heartbeat ago. Chaos erupted. Screams of the elite collided with the sound of breaking glass. Cade's hand shot out, grabbing the collar of my jacket with a grip of reinforced steel, dragging me toward the floor as another round whistled through the space my head had just occupied. You, he growled, his screaming. You're coming with me. The elevator didn't just ascend. It launched, a silent glass bullet aimed at the clouds. Behind us, the smoke from the Gala was a dying smudge on the waterfront, but inside the private lift, the silence was its own kind of violence. Sebastian Cade stood with his back to me, his shoulders broad enough to block out the skyline. He hadn't let go of my arm since the convoy left the pier, his grip a permanent brand of reinforced steel. When the doors hissed open, I wasn't met with a home. This was a fortress of chrome and cold, black marble, a high-altitude cage that overlooked the city like a gargoyle's perch. He shoved me toward a plush, charcoal gray sofa, but I didn't sit. I couldn't. My blood was still humming with the adrenaline of the shootout, and the sterile, expensive scent of the penthouse felt like a chokehold. "Stay," Cade commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. He moved to a mahogany sideboard, pouring 3 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. He didn't offer me any. He downed half of it in one swallow, his jaw working as he processed the night's wreckage. Across the room, Elena sat huddled in a wingback chair, wrapped in a cashmere throw that looked like it cost more than my bike. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the floor-to-ceiling windows where the rain lashed against the glass. She was safe, but the girl I'd seen laughing at the gala was gone, replaced by a ghost in silk. "You," Cade said, turning his predatory focus back to me. The light from the city threw his face into sharp, lethal relief. The alley. The photo. "Tell me again. Every detail. If you leave out so much as the color of the exhaust from that SUV, I'll know." "I told you." I rasped, my throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. "I was just making a delivery. I found it in the dirt. I saw a man, tactical gear, professional." He dropped it. Cade stepped into my personal space, the scent of expensive scotch and cold rain radiating off him. He reached out, his thumb catching the edge of the gash on my forehead. I winced, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't move. "Nick's Calder doesn't drop things," he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "He doesn't leave trails. And he certainly doesn't let bike couriers live to tell the tale." He leaned closer, his eyes searching mine for a lie I didn't have. "Which means you're either the luckiest girl in the city, or you're the bait I wasn't supposed to catch." He turned to a security monitor on the wall, a grid of flickering grayscale cameras. "You aren't leaving, Cheryl. Not until I know which one you are. Until then, consider this your new world. It's high, it's expensive, and it's the only place in this city where a bullet can't find you." He walked toward the master suite without a backward glance, leaving me alone in the shimmering silence of the clouds. I looked at the door. There were no handles on the inside. I wasn't a guest. I was a piece of evidence locked in a vault. The heavy tumbler of scotch remained untouched on the black marble counter, the ice cubes slowly sweating into a pool of condensation. Sebastian Cade hadn't moved for 20 minutes. He was hunched over the kitchen island, his focus pinned to the crumpled, water-stained photograph I'd pulled from the gutter. The soft, blue-white glow of the overhead recessed lighting made the image look even more like a tombstone. "His name is Nick Calder," Cade finally said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a resonance that felt like a low-frequency warning. He didn't look up. "In my world, he's less of a man and more of a natural disaster. You don't see him coming. You just deal with the wreckage after he leaves." I stood by the window, my arms wrapped tightly around my chest. The gash on my head had stopped bleeding, but the steady throb behind my eyes persisted. "You talk about him like he's a ghost." "He is," Cade replied, finally straightening up. He turned the photo toward me, tapping the red crosshair that hovered over his own heart. 10 years ago, Calder was a ghost I helped create. We were part of the same shadow unit, cleaners for the syndicates that didn't want to get their hands dirty. He was the best shot I'd ever seen. Cold. Mathematical. He didn't have a soul, he had a trajectory. He paused, a dark, fleeting shadow passing over his features. I left that life. I built an empire that didn't require me to hide in the rafters of warehouses. But Calder, he stayed in the dark. He became the blade for hire that no one could trace. To him, this isn't personal. It's a contract he hasn't finished yet. Cade walked over to me, his presence looming, smelling of rain and expensive oak. He held the photo up between us. "Do you see this angle? This wasn't taken from the lighthouse. It was taken from the old sugar refinery 3 miles out. No one makes that shot, Cheryl. No one except a man who spent 3 years in a Siberian sniper nest because I told him it was the only way to survive." The weight of his words sank into the room, heavier than the storm outside. This wasn't just a hit, it was a reckoning. "He's not just coming for me," Cade whispered, his gaze drifting toward the room where Elena was sleeping. He's coming for everything I built to replace him. And you're the first person in a decade to see his shadow before he stepped into it. He reached out, his hand hovering near my shoulder but never quite touching. The intensity in his eyes was no longer just predatory, it was desperate. He won't stop until the photo matches the reality. And now that he knows you saw him, you're the next target on his list. The rain transitioned from a steady drum to a violent thrash against the reinforced glass of the secondary Safehouse, a brutalist concrete villa tucked into the jagged cliffs of the northern coast. Cade had moved Elena there an hour ago, convinced that the penthouse was too high, too visible, too much like a target on a pedestal. But as I watched the perimeter cameras from the kitchen monitors, the shadows between the pine trees seemed to stretch and breathe. "He's here," I whispered, the hair on my arms standing up. The sensation wasn't logical. It was the same primal instinct that had made me pick up the envelope in the alley. Cade didn't question me. He surged toward the hallway just as the power died, plunging the villa into a thick, suffocating velvet blackness. The backup generators groaned but failed to kick in, a professional bypass. Then came the sound, not a blast, but a rhythmic thwip-thwip-thwip of a suppressed submachine gun shattering the kitchen skylight.
"Elena!
Get to the vault." Cade's voice was a jagged roar in the dark. He fired 2 rounds blindly into the ceiling, the muzzle flashes illuminating his face for a split second, a mask of pure, lethal rage. I dove behind the marble kitchen island as glass rained down like frozen sparks. In the strobe light effect of the lightning outside, I saw him. Nick's Calder wasn't a man. He was a silhouette of absolute darkness descending from the rafters on a high-speed line. He moved with a terrifying, silent economy, landing on the dining table without a sound. Elena screamed from the end of the hall, a sharp, terrified sound that cut through the thunder. Calder didn't aim for Cade. He swung his weapon toward the sound of the girl. He knew Cade's weakness. He was playing with the geometry of grief.
"No."
I scrambled out from behind the island, grabbing a heavy copper pot and hurling it toward the dining table. It was a pathetic, civilian move, but it was enough to draw Calder's cold, infrared gaze toward me for a single heartbeat. That heartbeat was all Cade needed. He tackled Calder midair, the 2 men crashing through the glass, sliding doors, and out into the mud and the lashing rain. I ran toward Elena, dragging her into the reinforced pantry and slamming the steel bolt home just as a grenade detonated in the courtyard. The shockwave rattled my teeth. Through the small, slit window of the pantry, I watched the 2 shadows tear at each other in the mud. Cade was a mountain of raw power, but Calder was a serpent, slipping through his grip, his combat knife flashing like a silver tooth in the dark. Calder wasn't trying to win a fight. He was checking his watch. He was waiting for something. By the time Cade's security team swarmed the courtyard with floodlights, the mud was empty. Calder had vanished back into the rain, leaving nothing behind but a spent casing and a single, terrifying realization. He wasn't trying to kill them yet. He was just testing the locks. The silence following the explosion was heavier than the storm. We were back in the armored SUV, the tires screaming against the asphalt as Cade drove with a white-knuckled ferocity that bordered on suicidal. Beside him, the surveillance photo lay on the dashboard, illuminated by the rhythmic, flickering amber of the hazard lights. "He's playing with us," Cade spat, his voice a jagged edge of frustration. "He could have ended it at the villa. He's pushing me toward a corner I can't see." I reached forward, my fingers trembling as I pulled the photo closer to my face. The red crosshair was a distraction, a bright, bloody lure designed to keep Cade looking at his own chest. But I wasn't a soldier. I didn't look at targets, I looked at streets. I looked at the skeletal architecture of a city that had been my only home since I was old enough to pedal a bike. "Stop the car," I whispered.
Cade didn't listen.
He accelerated, the needle climbing past 80. "Not now, Cheryl." "Sebastian, stop the damn car." I barked, the authority in my voice, surprising even me. The brakes hissed, the SUV fishtailing slightly before coming to a dead stop in the middle of a flooded underpass. Cade turned to me, his eyes dark with a lethal impatience, but I was already pointing at the blurred, grayscale background behind his left shoulder in the photograph. Everyone thinks he took this from the sugar refinery, I said, my heart beginning to race with a different kind of adrenaline. But look at the angle of that water tower. Look at the way the light hits that rusted iron lattice. Cade leaned in, his breath warm against my cheek as he squinted at the grain. It's a standard industrial tower. No, it isn't, I countered, tracing a tiny, almost invisible silhouette in the far distance. That's the old Crown Distillery in the South Basin. It was condemned 6 years ago. The refinery blocks the view from the lighthouse, but if you're on the roof of the distillery, you have a straight line of sight to your table at the Gala and a clear path to the North Pier. I knew that roof. I'd spent 3 summers hiding up there when the debt collectors came knocking on my mother's door. It was the only place in the city where the wind didn't smell like exhaust. It's a maze of underground tunnels and steam pipes, I continued, my mind mapping the city's veins. The police don't even have the blueprints anymore. But I do. I've delivered to the squatters there for years. If Calder has a nest, it's not in a high-tech hotel. It's in the one place where a ghost can actually disappear. Cade looked from the photo to me, the predatory intensity in his gaze softening into something that looked dangerously like respect. He didn't say a word. He simply shifted the car into gear and turned the wheel toward the South Basin. For the first time since the night began, we weren't just running. We were hunting. The South Basin was where the city went to rot, a skeletal landscape of rusted iron and crumbling brick that smelled of stagnant salt and old diesel. The old Crown Distillery loomed over the fog like a jagged tooth, its windows long since shattered, looking like hollowed-out eyes. Cade cut the engine and the lights a mile out, the SUV gliding into the shadows of a collapsed warehouse. "Stay behind me," Cade commanded, his voice barely a breath. He handed me a compact tactical headset and a sleek, polymer handgun. It felt cold and impossibly heavy in my palm. If you see a shadow move that isn't mine, you don't wait. You pull the trigger. I didn't tell him that my hands were shaking so hard the safety catch rattled. I just nodded, following the silhouette of his broad shoulders into the maw of the distillery. The air inside was thick with the scent of wet lime and iron. Rain hissed through the holes in the roof, creating a rhythmic, metallic dripping that masked the sound of our footsteps. I led him through the labyrinth of copper stills and rotted fermentation vats, navigating by the memory of my teenage escapes. We bypassed the main staircase, too loud, too exposed, and slipped into the freight elevator shaft, climbing the rusted service ladder in absolute darkness. Cade moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, his infrared goggles casting a ghostly green glow over his features. Every few floors, he would pause, his head tilting as he scented the air like a wolf. He wasn't just looking for an assassin, he was hunting a brother-in-arms. "4th floor," I whispered into the comms, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The steam pipes converge here. There's a blind spot behind the boiler room that overlooks the entire harbor." We crested the final rung and rolled onto the concrete floor. The silence here was different. It wasn't empty. It was occupied. The air held the faint, chemical tang of gun oil and the ozone of high-end electronics. Cade signaled for me to fan out to the left while he took the right. I crawled behind a row of rusted pressure valves, my knees scraping against the grit. Through a gap in the machinery, I saw it, a sniper's nest so precise it looked like a surgical suite. A long-range rifle was mounted on a tripod, its barrel slithering out of a narrow crack in the brickwork. Beside it sat a bank of monitors flickering with live feeds of Cade's Penthouse, his sister's Safehouse, and my blood ran cold, a GPS tracker currently hovering over our exact location. "Sebastian," I hissed into the mic, "it's a trap." The realization hit just as a red laser bloomed on the rusted boiler right next to my head. Calder wasn't in the nest. He was above us, perched on the steel rafters like a gargoyle. "Welcome home, Sebastian." A voice drifted down from the darkness, cold and devoid of human warmth. "I was wondering how long it would take for the girl to bring you to me." The infrared on the boiler wasn't a warning. It was a heartbeat away from a funeral. Down. Cade roared, his voice echoing through the hollow ribcage of the distillery as he shoved me behind a thick iron pillar. A high-velocity round hissed through the air exactly where my head had been, the impact sending a spray of orange sparks and pulverized brick into the darkness. "You're slowing down, Sebastian." Calder's voice drifted from the rafters, disembodied and mocking. "A decade ago, you would have smelled the ozone on the wires before you stepped into the room. Is the girl making you soft, or just careless?" Cade didn't answer with words. He moved like a shadow possessed, rolling from behind a fermentation tank and firing 3 rapid-fire shots toward the steel catwalks above. The muzzle flashes illuminated Nick's Calder for a fraction of a second, a wraith in matte black, moving with a terrifying, silent fluidity that made him look less like a man and more like a glitch in reality. They traded fire in a rhythmic, lethal staccato that shook the foundation of the old building. I pressed my back against the cold iron, my fingers trembling around the polymer grip of the handgun Cade had given me. I was a courier, a girl who spent her days weaving through traffic and her nights counting pennies. I had no place in this war of ghosts, yet the geometry of the room was shifting. Calder was pinned, but he was baiting Cade toward the exposed edge of the rooftop access, where the wind whipped through the open skylight. "He's leading you to the ledge." I screamed into the comms, but the sound of a shattering steam pipe drowned me out. Through the hissing white fog, I saw them collide on the rooftop. The rain was a torrential roar now, turning the concrete into a slide of slick moss and grit. They were silhouettes against the lightning, 2 titans tearing at each other with a history written in scars. Cade had the power, but Calder had the precision, his combat knife flashing like a silver tooth as he carved a line across Cade's shoulder. I realized then that Cade couldn't win this as a soldier. He was too busy protecting the space between Calder and me. I had to stop being the package. I had to be the delivery. I scrambled up the service ladder, my lungs burning, until I reached the roof's edge. 20 yards away, Calder had Cade pressed against a rusted railing that groaned under their combined weight. Calder's suppressed pistol was leveled at Cade's throat. "I don't miss, Sebastian," Calder whispered over the wind.
"Neither do I," he rasped.
I didn't aim for Calder. I aimed for the massive, rusted floodlight housing hanging precariously above the catwalk. I pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted my arm, but the bullet struck the corroded bracket. The heavy metal casing groaned and swung down, a 500-pound pendulum of iron. Calder flinched, his focus snapping toward the sudden scream of tearing metal. It was only a second, a heartbeat of distraction, but it was the only opening Sebastian Cade ever needed. He surged forward, his fist connecting with Calder's jaw with the force of a wrecking ball, sending the assassin over the railing and into the black, churning maw of the South Basin below. Silence returned, broken only by the rain and Cade's ragged breathing. He turned toward me, his face a mask of blood and rain, and for the first time, the predator's eyes were filled with nothing but light. The morning after the storm didn't bring peace, but it brought a clarity that the city hadn't seen in years. The South Basin was swarming with forensic teams, but high above the grit, in the silent, glass-walled sanctuary of the Penthouse, the air was still. Sebastian Cade stood by the window, his arm in a black silk sling, watching the sun struggle to break through the charcoal clouds. He looked less like a phantom of the underworld and more like a man who had finally put a ghost to rest. "The police found the casing," he said, his voice no longer a jagged rasp, but a steady, resonant hum. "And the water took what was left of Nick's Calder. The contract is closed, Cheryl." I sat at the marble island, a clean bandage on my forehead and a cup of coffee that cost more than my month's rent between my hands. I felt light, impossibly, dangerously light. For the first time in my life, I wasn't listening for the sound of a debt collector's boots or the rattle of a bike chain about to snap. Cade walked over, placing a single, heavy vellum envelope on the counter. It wasn't a death warrant this time. "Your sister's medical arrears, your mother's back taxes, and every cent you owe to the predatory lenders in the Docklands. It's gone. Scrubbed. You don't owe this city a single heartbeat anymore." I stared at the envelope, my throat tightening.
Why?
I just delivered a photo, Sebastian. You did more than deliver, he said, leaning against the counter, his dark eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. You navigated a maze I was lost in. You saw the city's veins when I only saw its targets. I'm moving away from the shadows, Cheryl. I'm launching a logistics and security firm, one that operates in the light, moving high-value assets through the toughest corridors in the world. It needs someone who knows the shortcuts, someone who doesn't blink when the world turns cold. He reached out, his thumb grazing my jaw with a lingering, grounded warmth. No more bikes. No more late-night runs for tips. I'm offering you a seat at the table, not as a courier, but as a partner. You've spent your life running from things. I want to see what happens when you start running toward them. Beside me. I looked out at the city, the skyline no longer looking like a throne of lights, but like a map I had finally mastered. The debt was paid, but the journey was just beginning. I reached out and took his hand, the grip firm and certain. When do we start? I asked. Cade's lips curved into a rare, dangerous smile.
Now.